Okay, so we're just going to meditate for a bit.
Breathing exercise. Breathing exercise 10 times together. 다음 대시 subject 시와 소소랑 신세로. 소소랑 신수 다 진지 시에요. 다들 뭐 고등어 시에네 뭐 아까 고등어 시에는 먼저 코어하게 에너지 탐지 주요도 subject 와 subject sab발라디 요모체 아니 요모제 그 야면 카셰게 미과신 요모제거를 그 미과하고라 미제 니 요모제거를 먼저 되자지 컨로지거를 유를 미과
Oh, yeah, okay.
아니 카셰 수수 유라 ngaje chenpo yu na yang yu sem de chuk yung kore tansan la yu la ming ji kore yuwa tabu song
So the mikba dini nagyo any something?
ye pena sakwa la ora sakwa
Right.
sa de sakwa mikba dan sungdeng ge la mikbe ko ne ge was nyomo sakwa se de nyomo re nyomo
Okay, yeah.
sakwa si nyomo che ro nyomo de ya pere ya ro
Yeah.
예, 상상라 유믹제. 만약 총관도나 잘라닝제 오진 마디 잘라디 고도세 잘라디 통는 나게 되바신 보디 핀도.
Yeah, okay.
디믹베 거네지.
Right. Oh, okay.
아 니버디 안내 디교다.
Okay, so alright, so now we get to the fourth section, which is the nature of each individual noble truth. So we say samsara is it's like contaminated, and this contamination it's contaminated with delusions, right? So how do these delusions come about? Well, there's one view that says they come about when one is in contact with an object. That either one then arises like a delusion based on that. So, for example, if we're out and about and we see, say, visual contact with an object of attachment, like a beautiful person or a beautiful car or something like that, then we can say that increases a certain attachment. So there's this view is that these delusions arise due to contact with the object.
아직이 총대게 유 매베이네. 스스 강과전한데 리좀 되나니. 스스 셈기 양데 서제. 아니 녀모야 페기도.
Right.
뭐 도스첸 당한서 녀모데 도스첸 페고 그랬어.
Right. Okay, then the other times you might be alone, like in just say your room, and then a delusion can arise without any contact with an external object. So this is another way delusion can arise.
다디 할딩 그랬으나 아니 유기 찾아요.
Okay.
서제 유튜브 찾아라 고민된 봐. 레뷰 찾아라 동의된 봤어. 그다음에 그 가르쳐서는 다 사제 야야 되나 아니 레다 녀모를 돌아.
Right.
레다 녀모디 아니 고정된 봤어.
Right.
다 단단 알아서 본 것이 아니 레뷰 선자 될라 동의된 봤어. 이 고알렌다. 동의된 거 고정된 거 고알렌다들.
Okay. So how does this type of delusion arise when it's not in contact with an object? Well, we say this arises due to karmic causes or karma or action, right? And then the result of that karma or action is the delusion. So we can say that these delusions are samsara, the way samsara exists, is based on these karma and delusions, right? Because they cycle through this repeatedly, karma and delusion, and that's how samsara functions or operates. Okay. Okay. So these aggregates So the combination for new people, it's like basically the combination of the body and mind. These aggregates are said to be the result, and therefore they are said to be, the result is the truth of suffering, right? So these aggregates are said to be in the aspect of the truth of suffering. Okay. Sorry, we haven't. Oh. Thanks, Udon. Yeah. Not much fun in doing mindfulness meditation when you forget to put your microphone on after. I don't think we've all got this, but I'll hand them out next. I printed out the definitions of each of the Four Noble Truths. No, but I'll read them to you as we go. So yeah, they're not in this handout. I printed them separately, but we've still got to do them for everybody. So I'll do that after this session. Right. Okay. So this first bit here, which in Tibetan is Kunan Nyomong Choki, which is within the aspect of the truth of pervasive affliction, right? So what does this actually mean, right? So when you break it down, this chok here, it translates here as aspect, but literally it means direction. So these aggregates which we have, they are in the aspect or in the direction of this suffering, to simplify it down, right? So that's this essence of what it means. They're in the direction of this affliction or suffering. So these aggregates, right? Like when we really meditate and examine and we look at our head, our eyes, all the different aspects, then these are all in the aspect or come about in the aspect of delusion, right? So basically, when we look at our aggregates, it's basically karma and delusion are having a big old party, and this is what we get at the end. So when we look at this, the first two truths, the truth of suffering and the truth of the origin. So when we look at the second one, and we look at our aggregates, our body and our mind, right? And then we might sort of look at our body and we all have a heart, right? And then if you're checking, then you check, well, how, what is this heart? How does it work? And like somebody might investigate, and they could read books on it. For example, like somebody who knows about medicine would check, and then they can understand how it works. So they can say, okay, for example, it's a muscle, and it does this many beats a day, and you can break it down to the second. So you can look at how it functions. But this is quite different. This is an intellectual understanding of how something works. But when we actually check, look at our mind, we can't see anyway. We have no idea how our heart actually works, right? Right. Right. So, in the same way, like we shouldn't, we often check things outside and we might look at people and go, oh, this is good, this is bad. But when we actually look at ourselves and look at our own body, we basically really have no idea how it works or, how it functions. So somebody might say to you, okay, so do you have a heart? And you're going to go, of course, yes. But then when they ask you, how do you know you have a heart? Well, what's your answer then? Like substance?
Substance. And there's substance jignala ya substance kazuya tana ma chung dangra. And dende jignala ngandu nangba karseyosna. Ani duze ge chisuwa sa chu me lung.
Okay.
Ani chi ro rekja hago son
taste raw sound.
Sound yama.
Tree. Tree. Oh, smell. Sorry. Of course, smell. Tree, raw, recture, feeling. Contact.
Raw. Soup.
Oh no, directure. Raw.
Soup. Tree, raw, recture.
Sug.
Oh,
you guys know the 8?
Yeah.
So.
What? Eight element.
Yeah.
And then
smell, taste,
touch,
sight.
Touch, and sight. Okay, thank you.
That 제주 탐무직 나나이나 어 되게 게요 디시고 레스 남바. that 되게 control physics 다다다로 되게 modern.
Right.
Physics. 다 남바 체리글래도 도시고.
Okay, so. So, when we sort of kind of now examine our body, right, and we check it, and then we can say, okay, on a gross level, it has basically skin, blood, bone, etc., right? But when we analyze deeper, what the meditators came to the conclusion is it's actually made up of 8 elements, right? So you have the 4 earth, wind, fire, water, right? And then the 4 of taste, smell, touch, and sight. Now, these are very subtle, like this is a very subtle makeup of the body. And he says, nowadays quantum physics or physics is coming to sort of similar conclusions when they break things down. Can you not hear? Is there some way to turn the volume up a little bit? It's okay?
Yeah.
Alright. That dinner, 사실 당도 수고도 당연히 검자해 봐. 아주 수고 내절 따야지. 또 따야. 수고들 안신이 가르다. 오늘 안신 가래라지. 미다고 안신. 다 남마산이 왜디? 미다고 안신 레스라고. 콜라야 수고디 제시제 수고디 제시제 콜라 제주 시샤고 미다 동에 또 다음에 다 진이 마데스 게르담이나 당기 먼저 대위차를 샤라 다는 마데스 띵사로 로이나 근데 이제 풍부대 여름에 풍부대라 제시제 제주시 미다 동에 또 다음에 어디에 사나 그 동에 되면 차로 그랬다.
Okay. So when we look at our body and meditate on its nature, right, these aggregates, and what is the nature of these aggregates? Well, the nature is, the first one is impermanence. So if we look in the definition here, so the first thing we said was the basis is this, the aspect, it's in the aspect of the truth of pervasive affliction. And then it's distinguished by 4 qualities, right? Those qualities being impermanence, suffering, selflessness, and okay. These 4 are actually on the last page of the handout you do have, and emptiness, right? Okay. Yeah. The first top line. 4 attributes of the truth of suffering: permanent suffering, emptiness, and selflessness.
다 디셔 이제 다 당고 제주 당고도 시야라. 제주 당고도 제시디 나한테 풍고를 잡아. 풍고. 나한테 풍고대 상다로. 제시 풍고대. 여와는 거 풍고대. 나한테 풍고대. 나한테 류디. 디셔. 버리 먼저 버리 들어.
Yeah.
다들 제시. 다들 제주 당고대 미다고 그래서 보고. 다들 상다 미다고 그래서.
Aspect impermanence. Okay. So, if we look at these aggregates as the base, right? So this is the base, which is the aspect of suffering, right? And then there's 4 aspects to that, and the first of those being impermanence. Okay. Right.
남식 징도 그래서 가르스나 아니 메다제보다 메다제 페놀체 아니 간사제 텔라디 세월에 and this the 텔라디 세일 파티는 간사제 예로다. 아니 아마도.
Okay. So there's this example or this word or this phrase that's used in the scriptures. Basically, Ringekyo means sometimes produced, right, or occasionally produced. Now, this is the example of a human being. Could be used for this example. So, human being, basically, you're only born once, right, and then so this is when you're produced, and then you slowly disintegrate, and your body changes over time, and then you die, and at that point, that aspect of that person is finished. And then, so this is what it's meant by sometimes produced or occasionally produced.
다디 지금 다디네 먼저 미다고 써야 되냐 미다고 라고당 타모스니 셔.
Right.
미다고 라고데 먼저 미시 통그래 강바로로 강바마로로도 강바 안다 강바 빌딩지 고제나 사임 잡스나나 강바식제 강메어 샤로다. 미다고래 거 징사라. 미다고 아니 단다데 니들로데 잡용도 다 팅산다. 배 야고도 단다디 배든데 망고도 아틴두기 배든데 망고. 아니 데모든데 다디 데모단데 유유나 데모나나 메어 샤로다.
La Timon.
데모 모빈
Okay.
모빈도 나나 인데 여러 아니 그 단다 유기야 매우 잘하고다 지도다 그래서 미다고라 걸어 미다고 참은데 아니 게지게 배나만도 미다고라 거디 딜라 추도를 배자잖아 리래 추도 찍대 미다고라 걸어 그래 추도 찍 가면서 둘이다 배열어 세계 두제열어 안데 마마마 세계 찍나라 밀리파무 탁탁탁탁 로라 디 나라 나세 단도 가자만 고여라. 나세 탁라지 디 제일 주주 디나가 마마마마 차시는 그거는 빼 먹고 쳐요라. 일단 주 나게 딱 주주 채운데 로직, 다와직, 비다직, 니마직, 주주직, 까마숨직, 까마족직, 까마직, 세겐직, 밀레직, 주주 마마마 주 다마 주 텔레다 주 차체주면에 주지여라. 띵안 저 하고 말이야. 띵안 저 하고 파과 통과다. 파과 통과.
So then we get on to subtle impermanence. So this, what we talked about there is gross impermanence, right? So we see this, like a building is an example, right? We can see something being built, and then, you know, if there's an earthquake or something happens and the building falls down, then we can see it being destroyed. So that's gross impermanence, and there's many examples of this. Like you watch a movie, so you can see all these things happening, and the movie finishes and it's over, right? So this is a gross impermanence. We all kind of have an understanding of this, but when we look at subtle impermanence, then it breaks down into very small periods of time, right? So if we use time as the example here, so it's basically moment by moment things are changing, right? So if you take time, so you can take an hour and then you break that down into a minute, then you break that down into a second, and then you break it down more into basically like a millisecond. The exact translation of Kechik is moment, but it's like a very small portion of time, so something like a millisecond, right? And you can break time down in this way into year and month, days, then hours, then seconds, then milliseconds. Now, for us, we can't basically perceive things in a millisecond level. We only perceive gross changes. But for a realized being, like an Arya being, they actually perceive things in the millisecond, right? By millisecond, and how things change. Yeah.
제산다 남마산제에 저 유제 탐제 미다고 해서 왔다. 유제 지금 dünya tudinje jaro. 그래서 상마 유단 대부 남샤에 이도 상마 미다고 깨지게 뒤로 고 요어도제 대그러면서 가도 있는 대대요 요 말에서 지고 왔다. 가도 고 요어도제 대리고 그래서 구요전 되고 그래라고.
So Buddha actually taught, right, that all produced phenomena are impermanent. Okay? So anything that's a product of the law of cause and effect is by nature impermanent, and that means it's subtly changing and disintegrating moment by moment. Right? So it changes moment by moment by moment until the time when it ceases to exist.
동요. 동요 레스 아주 풍부히 시에고 아주 풍부히 동요 인식을 말아. 아주 동요라디 야면은 막 거나고래 야면은 지 나자로 지 동요들라 나자 동요 지그러면서 아주 풍부히 동요라 시리스 말아. 그 파고게 시기요. 아주 파고게 동요라 시바 시기요. 가르스는 콜라라와요 말했다. 더더더더니 내년이 시원제라. 동요에 비주들이 콜라라와요. 콜라 시원하레스. 시원 인사네 딱 디기요 말. 콜 시원지 주대 위에서 와. 콜라 디기요 말. 디기요야 말한테 디기. 디기지가 지고래. 지 칼라신 브라기 사나. 제대 저거 나거든. 단다 수부탄다레 말아 프롬에 말아 강게 개면은 기부이 되게 매시그러. 내가 디기리 이나 뭐디 동해라 시레스고. 그래서는 그 예지 태는 미지 저 미도 자도는 미도 자면 나야 오이나라 감사. 돌아anje 사고마기를 찾아라. 어디에 갈 때에서는 그 예능이 공부도 당연히 범죄죠. 공부를 따이 봐. 근데 뭐 보라 동해라 시레스. 이메준제 레뇽이 시험을 콜라라마요 말했다.
Okay. So then that's the first one. That's the first of these four aspects, which is the aspect of impermanence. The next one is the aspect of suffering, right? So these aggregates, now, it actually, Nirlang is actually is appropriated, contaminated aggregates, but I'm just going to say aggregates because I have trouble saying appropriated, contaminated aggregates all the time. So just assume that the rest is there. So when we don't see these aggregates in the nature of suffering, right? However, we see something like a headache. A headache is suffering, or a sickness is suffering. But the Arya beings, they don't see it this way. They see these aggregates in the nature of suffering. Now, why is that? Because they're not under their own power, right? They're under the power of something else, and that is karma and delusion. And while they're in the sway of karma and delusion, you're never going to have any stable or lasting happiness. So, for example, if we eat delicious food and it's great at the time, but then we eat too much and we have a sore stomach, this is how things are constantly changing for us. So people might think, I've got no difficulties now, no problems, I've got enough money in the bank, actually I'm happy. But it's not the case, right? Because that happiness is only temporary and it's not stable. Because the moment you come in contact with something that causes your delusions to arise, so let's say somebody abuses you, says, "Oh, you're useless and you're stupid," immediately you get angry and say, "Oh, I'm not useless and stupid," and you get upset about it. So this is why the under the sway of this karma and delusion, you're always suffering, and that's why it's said that these contaminated appropriate aggregates are in the nature of suffering. Plan.
야 사상가 라고 영어절라 되게 여러 거라 직도가 직차제 리더들 여러 거
leg
해줘야지 leg
okay. Okay. Yeah.
수수기 플랜 여말 거라 플랜직 리워야지 여기
Right.
어디 뒤에 leg 왕도
Okay.
쳤어요.
So when we say we're under the power of karma and delusion, right? Often people might think that they're under their own power and that they can, they're in control of their situation, but this is actually not the case, right? So, we're in various ages, 20, 30, 40 sometimes, so we all have various experiences and we all kind of have plans for how we want to do things. But as you know, those plans, they don't always work out the way you think, right? And you might try very hard to make some plan work, and of course completely the opposite thing happens and you're all messed up and it becomes a total disaster, right? And this is what is meant by you're under the sway of the karma and delusion, It's not like just because you want something to happen, it magically happens like that. You're under the control of the karma and delusion, and that's why things generally get a bit funky sometimes. How do I explain funky in Tibetan? I'll have to think about this one. I don't know how to. I keep picking and one.
디난 저디 마음과 따라 야고 차그레스 아베디 지도 폴리틱 관계냐 로이나 아니 메지 폴리틱로 차제 이외로 말했어 데 리들 미만자데 런데 지금도 폴리틱을 랩지 여러 랩 시스템지로 페이스 미가젤 트루 페이스 3 페이스 5 페이스
Okay.
디 야오마 페이스 지게네 그래서
Okay, so some people have like a genuine. So there's many examples of how people understand common delusion, right? Some people genuinely have a wish to help others, and they'll engage in things to try and do that. But often, people in situations are not like that. So if you get, for example, politicians, right? Politicians have like many faces, right? So some people have 2, 3, 4, 5 faces, right? So they I don't know, if you understand this term, it's like they display different personalities depending on what they want from other people, right? I guess this is not really the way to be. You should be genuine and straight with people and just have like one face.
아니 이제 다디 다 단다도다디 말아도 단다 르덴데라 르덴디 겨들래야디 밀르래야디 라요 말에가 밀르 내게 내가 할을 겨랭이 라야 말에 거라 밀르 겨래야 레디 간 액션 요모 그서 타디 고 밀르 겨래 오레스 다 할을 겨랭이 나니 지 다신 겨랭이 저랑 겨 먹고 도스다 겨 먹고 도다 겨 먹고 도다 아니 다시는 겨랭이 그랬으면
Okay. Right, so nanta la kigimara, nanta mi kigura did it. Okay. So we have this, this body as a human, right? Like and this comes about not from our own power. This comes about through karma and delusion. Through that we're born as a human. And it's not like humans are perfect, right? We all have difficulties, problems. It's not like we were born as gods. If we were born as gods and we were just kind of cruising around having a good time, that'd be different. But for that, you have to have a lot of positive karma to be born as a god.
다디네 먼저 수고디 뭐 가르쳐야잖아. 전신이 다 미다 중에 동아래라서
Okay.
동아래스 전신이 다 동아래스 먼저.
Okay, yep.
다단다 디레디.
Trawa mepa diro.
솔도 요 말해서. 공부디 솔 요 말해서. 솔 뭐 요 말해서.
Okay, so now we get on to the third aspect of the 4 attributes of the truth of suffering, which is empty. So what are we empty of? It's empty of I've used the translation separate self here. So this would be an example of something like a soul, right? We don't have a self that's separate from the aggregates. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Okay. So I'm thinking no by the looks on people's faces. So for example, right, like let's say this is your aggregates and we think I'm over here controlling the aggregates. And then the soul, for example, is separate from the aggregates and kind of is some separate aspect that's our self. That's empty of that. Yeah? No? Okay. I think that's the best I've got, sorry.
전신이 다 또. 다다 얘는 풍부디 아니 다다 전신이 다 다시 런신 주어서죠. 하고 저 런서죠.
Right.
근데 뭐 주요 말해시고 다 치료가 나 힌두들이 세우고 힌두 여러 힌두주로게 아니 풍불의 전신배 다고 주어서 다를 제주 숨쉬고라 제가 얘는 풍부디 디모 주요 말 디동을 해시고
The Sumba Shiba?
단단히 숨벌다.
Sumba, okay.
전신이 다 동사.
Right.
전신이 다 동사 다디 가르쳐 동야 다서 딱지 런신 주어 디동. 다고 주 런여.
Right.
지금 디 동. 근데 다 두요 말은 근데 주 담제 디 동을 해서.
So the other aspect is a self that is permanent and under its own power, right? And this is what the Hindus will hold to as this. I think they call it Atma, right? This is in the Hindu tradition. Many of those beliefs hold to this permanent and self-powered like aspect of self, right? So this is also empty of that. So it's a little different to the Christian idea of a soul, but it's the self-empowered and it's permanent, which means not momentarily changing. They hold to a self like that as being like the ultimate nature, and this is our existence is empty of that as well. Yeah. Okay, right. So okay. So then we get on to this. It's at the last one, which is tagmi, selflessness. So it's the absence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self of a person, right? So this is not the Madhyamika Prasangika view that's presented in the Four Noble Truths. This is a less, more gross version of selflessness of a person. So if you understand the four tenet systems, this is not the highest view, or was the Madhyamika Prasangika view. It's held by other schools within that tenet system. Okay, yeah. So the Madhyamika Prasangika say that there's no self that exists from its own side, right? It's empty of any sort of existence from its own side. That's the Prasangika Madhyamika view. Right. So this concludes the truth, the four attributes of the truth of suffering. So these are if you have these four aspects, if it's in the direction of basis of affliction and it has these four aspects, then that is the truth of suffering. Oh, okay. Okay.
The case is important for to part this.
Right.
Right.
So for understanding these Four Noble Truths, right, especially the first one, then it's very important to have the mindfulness of body. It's very important for the understanding of these. So in order to understand the delusions, like the 6 delusions such as attachment, aversion, pride, jealousy and so forth, right? It's important first, these arise based on the aggregates. So it's first important to understand the aggregates, right? So when we meditate, we need to kind of examine these aggregates, and then as we kind of do that and our understanding grows, then our mind, and we get more subtle, our mind becomes more and more relaxed and calmer and calmer and calmer.
텔레디네 용고요 다 자와디 공부 다 들어오는데 뭐데 용고요다
So the Buddha actually taught it's very important to understand understand the body, right? The body and the aggregates. So if all the suffering we have comes from this aspect of self-cherishing, right? Cherishing ourselves. And then when you bring that down, it actually comes down to self-grasping, grasping this aspect of self. And then that actually comes about due to holding these aggregates as being ourselves. We see ourselves as aggregates. So that's from that comes self-grasping, self-cherishing, and suffering.
Other day, do it about it. That would you never? Would you never? When you must never say, did you watch it? And then like Kejushi, would you never Kejushi, you Kunjung, Laki, Genshi? You would.
Okay, so now we get the truth of origin, right? So when we look at the definition, I'll just read it out. Within the aspect of the truth of pervasive affliction and being thoroughly distinguished and qualified by the four, cause, origin, forceful production, and condition. So that first bit is the same, right? It's within the aspect of the truth of pervasive affliction. So that's the same as the First Noble Truth, right? That's the aspect of the direction that it comes from. And then what identifies this truth from the first one is those four aspects that are different. So the aspects of the truth of the origin, here on the last page B, cause, origin, it says production here, but it's forceful production is a better translation because it's rubbed here, and then conditions.
당부상 수주 풍부들 상고 풍부란 인상다라 풍부들 간에 중을에 상당고 풍부들 로 풍부들 간에 중 대동에 된 거라 간에 중을에 상대 당기 세우는 밤에 부터 되네 아 내단 요모 로 내단 요모 내단 요모 될라 아니 군주 된 바스 당만 군주 된 두두로 아 내지 군주 된 요모 군주 된 요모 뭐들에 가서 되자시 당고는 아예 두두 참마 군주 된 거다
So when we look at these aggregates, these contaminated, appropriated aggregates, we say that they're in. When we look at where do they come from, and we say that they're in the nature of suffering, right? But how do they come about? They come about through karma or action and delusion. So through this karma and delusion, then that is said to be the origin of. The truth of the origin of our aggregates and the origin of all our suffering, right? And these, there's many different delusions, but we can look at the main ones like anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, etc., like that.
동행이 자와 유세야 되는 것도 되고 그러나 자와 그러나 유디 라데 동행이 자와 만나서 단다 먼저 심마지와 남마지와 용구도 와 되게 자와디 아니 뉴먼 토데요 레스 단지도 토데요 레스 그 단지 뒤에는 먼저 차단 용어라서 차단 관계 먼저 마지와 용어 동행 그래서 동행이 자와를 해서
Okay. So if we break it down, right? So we say karma and delusion are the cause of our unhappiness, or the root of the root. If we look, so therefore, if we analyze and we look, at the root of our unhappiness, right? If we break it down, we can see that delusions are the cause for all our unhappiness. And then if we look at what's the cause for that, we can break it down to this aspect of self-grasping. But these delusions is said to be whatever kind of disturbs the mind, agitates the mind, right? And then that, in turn, that agitation is what we regard as the suffering.
저 딩모서 뭐 딩모서 코 딩모서
Okay.
다들 라미도 동에서는 소설에도
Right. So the problem, though, however, is we're habituated with a different way of looking at the situation. So here, according to the Buddha, he's saying that delusions are the cause of our unhappiness, and that breaks down to our three root delusions: attachment, aversion, and ignorance. Right? But that's not how we see the situation. Whenever we're unhappy, we go, "Oh, this person did this, and it's their fault, or this thing happened." So we're always looking externally and seeing that as the cause for our unhappiness. But according to what Buddha taught, that's absolutely not the case.
다들 기억하는데 생각도 쓰고라 생각 저것도 쓰고 쓰고라
I think you probably got that, but so we're all like pointing the finger out there, but we need to turn it and go like this.
Much easier. 네, 사실 배우셔도 상비로 그전에 three finger insert, but this good measure, three put insert, one put and Buddhism one no put out and put insert. Four put insert, 그래서 왜 나는 되게 니만하는 저도 예제 강에 랑상 파상마다 마시 수수기 상담지 수수기나 규진데 가서 상담이나 아니 랑상 내주 친주디 쳐보자 말했어.
Right.
빼편도 때문에 매제는 빼편도 좀 뭐 디상다.
Okay, yeah. So how is this? We've got to actually integrate this type of thinking into our daily lives, right? So when we actually encounter difficulties and problems, rather than immediately blaming it on the external situation and getting all wound up about it, if we actually start to look at how did it come about, what are the real causes and conditions that bring about these difficulties, it has the immediate advantage of not making a small problem into a big problem, right? Because the more you get caught up in the external side of things, the bigger the problem becomes. The more you actually look at what genuinely caused it, it gives you, it stops it growing out of control, right? So in this way, this is mentioned many times in the scriptures that this is the way to do things, right? Okay, so we'll stop here.
Page 31.